Hello, it's me again. For some reason, I'm thinking about giving readings and all the readings I've given over the years. I think because this morning I was doing a video and I mentioned Joanne Harris and how we'd read together many years ago in Glasgow and nobody turned up but the proverbial one blind man and his dog who sat at the back, and how everybody has at least one reading. Some of us have more than one reading in which hardly anybody turns up. Do you remember a couple of years ago, there was a woman who said on Twitter that she'd had a novel out and nobody turned up, and loads of novelists replied saying that it happens to everyone. And the next year, somebody else did it about their Edinburgh Festival, Fringe Festival show, and loads of people popped up, comedians, saying it happens to everyone. But it turns out she was a kind of serial offender, and she was just after the attention on Twitter. Anyway, I have done a lot of readings where the audience was thin on the ground, not for want of trying. You put the stuff out there and you say you're going to be there, and it's the luck of the draw, isn't it? It's the weather, the kind of event, how hard it is to get to. I remember doing something in Birmingham in 2000 for a novel called Modern Love, and it was a really nice woman who'd organised it, an ex-student who was in charge of this arts centre, but it was right in the middle of the fuel crisis in 2000. I think there was strikes, and so nobody was getting about, and I went on the train and there was a handful of people there. But the awful thing was, old friends from years before from college were there, and it felt kind of slightly shaming. There were slightly snooty friends, and they loved the fact that nobody had turned out but them. And they brought another friend, a lovely bloke who used to work behind the bar in the Duke's Cinema in Lancaster, where we used to drink Guinness at the bar, and we used to flirt. I used to flirt with him, and nothing ever happened. I never saw him again. And then years afterwards, he turns up at this reading, which was lovely. But when we were introduced, oh, you remember Stephen? I hesitated slightly because I was trying to think of his name, and the fella kind of slightly flinched, or realised that I'd taken a second to remember his name, and I felt so guilty for that. He was so nice. He's nicer than anybody else I saw on that whole trip, just about. And yeah, the moment of just not quite remembering and then remembering. So I try my best to remember everybody's name and who everybody is all the time, but you can't always. Anyway, readings often bring people out of the woodwork like that from the past. I remember doing one somewhere on the outskirts of Manchester, and this woman comes over with her fella, and she's going, "Do you remember me? I'm off the course." How many courses had I taught over the years? And I had no idea until she explained slightly grumpily that she'd been on the same, no, not grumpily at all, perplexed perhaps. She'd been on the same course as I had at Lancaster when we did our MA. And this was a long time later, 25 years later or something. Anyway, we got that cleared up and realised who she was. She'd been quite eccentric on the course. She was, with me, one of the only working class people doing the MA in creative writing at Lancaster that year. It was very, very middle class. And she'd been patronised just as much as I had, more so. And she used to type on a typewriter the same as me. Yes, socks? Can you hear him shout? And her typing wasn't very good, and it was full of mistakes. And she used to get hell from people on that course about tidying her work up. And of course, they meant more than tidying up, just more than her work. All right. Come on. He's very noisy. Socky, come on. Anyway, so that was one where somebody turned up. Other people have turned up out of the blue because they know you're going to be on show and they come and say hello again. There was once a friend whose wife brought him to a reading in Whitby, in the Whitby bookshop. And I used to do at least 2 a year at the Whitby bookshop when the Brenda and Effie books were coming out. And there's Socks right behind me. You can see him on the desk. Um, and they used to put on a lovely gig and put me in a big armchair, and there'd be a signing. And sometimes it would be so busy for these new Brenda hardbacks, there'd be a queue outside and people couldn't get in. And there was once hell on because these women had come down from Newcastle and couldn't get in the bookshop. That was a triumph. At this particular thing, somebody from school who I'd known when I was 11, who was a bit of a little bully. He'd been my friend, but I was kind of bullied by him for a long time. And he turned up with his wife, and she said it would be nice if we could be friends again, because he was missing old friends in his life, and I'd been a good influence on him, and how nice that would be. And he agreed. And then they said, well, we're going now, we'll not stop for the reading. And off they went, having left me their card or whatever, or their address. It's very, very odd behaviour. Because I think if you've got someone who's a friend who publishes and writes books, vice versa, writes books and publishes, you really have to support them. And that means being at the readings when you can, and buying the book, and being there, and being part of the crowd, and looking like it's all marvellous and a big success. You have to gather around them and do that. I know that from long, hard-won experience. And if you don't turn up and you don't buy the book, you're a complete ratbag. It's even more important than people when they put on plays or do anything like that, because in plays, the lights go down and nobody knows or cares who else is there. With book readings and book launches, the lights are on and you see everyone. I've had various parties over the years. They're all a waste of money, of course. They should be publicity departments in publishing houses are based on a very old-fashioned model, based on the idea that everybody's in London and it's a very small world, and they all go to these parties and they buy each other's, they take notice of each other's books and give a shit. And it's not like that now. It's a different kind of world. I've had a few, and often it's about getting the press in and trying to get some stories in print about the book coming out. So when Strange Boy came out, Simon & Schuster did a thing in the Shadow Lounge in Soho, which was quite fancy, and we could have lots of people there, but a lot of the people there were media people. I had lots of my friends and family, though. That was excellent, seeing them in a gay nightclub. And my mum came down, and lots of friends from the past, lots of writer friends, and I've got fantastic photos taken by Lisa Bowerman of that whole evening. And my editor was Steve Cole, so there's lots of lovely pictures of us. David Shelley was another of my editors at that point, at Allison and Busby, and he's there looking about 12 at this point. He's the one that's now in charge of everything in publishing in the world, I believe. And who else? Jacqueline Wilson came in because she was a big supporter of Strange Boy, my first book for a younger audience. And my sister was then 16, and she was amazed to see Jacqueline Wilson, her favourite writer, come in and go to the bar so I could introduce them. And Louise just gawped at Jackie Wilson. Anyway, that was a really good do, and it was fantastic to have my mum there. She was glowing with pride. She was, we had to lift her down the twisty metal steps of the Shadow Lounge because she was in the wheelchair. And Socks, you're making my jeans filthy, my white trousers. But she was there, and it was fantastic. And we had one for Never the Bride in the Hospital Museum, St Thomas's Hospital in London. And I was with Headline for the Brenda books, and the publicist was quite peculiar. I did say we need to get somewhere for the launch that's accessible. for people who were older, for in wheelchairs, whatever. So she chose somewhere that was at the top of a spiral staircase of 200 steps up a tower. I don't know how the logic of that worked. That was a funny do, because again, it was lots of industry people, and that was the one where the fellow who was the famous horror anthologist took me aside at the buffet and he said, my book was no good. He ate all the buffet, drank all the booze, so did his partner, and then told me that they thought my book was a piece of callow pastiche, which was nice. It's very odd. People behave quite oddly sometimes at these kinds of do's. And I remember being at things for the British Council early on. I've told the story of going for my first launch, my first story being out, and going for a British Council party in Books Etc. on Charing Cross Road. I went back a few years running for those because I was in the subsequent volumes. And there was one in Islington Waterstones upstairs. And I wasn't picked to read ever for those. They always picked somebody more famous, and there was a very boring reading going on. And there was a wine waiter, and I remember copping off with the wine waiter just to fill the time while this reading was going on in Islington. So it was my kind of tribute to Joe Orton. That's what I did. That was one of the most exciting launches I'd been at, book parties I'd been at. I'm trying to think of others. I remember being at one, and it was for the launch of a competition, the David T. Wong Prize at UEA, that I was going to be doing the judging for, and it was a businessman who put loads of money in, and it was about encouraging people to write about the Far East or something. And that was the do. It was in London, and I met Faye Weldon for the first and only time, who was very nice. And Denise Riley was there, our lovely poet, who came from South Shields, actually, but she didn't have a South Shields accent by then. She'd lived in London for so long, and she had a very breathy, glamorous accent like this. And she's wonderful, Denise. Got lots of stories about Denise. She was one of my pals at UEA. And this was early on at my time at UEA, and Andrew Motion was there, hobnobbing with everyone and talking like this to everyone, blah, 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 as he does. And Denise said, tell me, Andrew, how do you do all the work you do as Poet Laureate and Professor? And she was mixing it and being naughty. How do you fit it all in? And he said, oh, well, Denise, it's very difficult, but I just make Paul do all my work at UEA. Paul does all the work. And I stood there feeling like an absolute pranny. And Jeremy's jaw hit the floor. He was so cross. But what do you do? Very funny, though. Looking back, very funny. And I was reminded, I was looking at diaries of a do for Lorna Sage at the Polish Embassy in London, and meeting people like Rose Caveney for the first time, who came galumphing over in a towering red wig and demanded to be introduced, and introducing Ali Smith to Maureen Duffy, and Ali Smith going down on one knee to this lesbian forebear and paying tribute as if she was in Camelot. It was like Camelot of scribbling lesbians. But the first ever reading I did and went to was in Middlesbrough for the Middlesbrough Festival at a pub in 96. Now, at that point, 95, I think, autumn 95, and I'd had out a story which had got a fair amount of attention, and a first novel was about to come out. And this lovely festival put me on, and they put me on with the fellow who wrote Our Friends in the North. And he was just about to film it. He was heading north, he was heading to Newcastle, and they were about to start filming this amazing TV show that was going to become a landmark TV show, a classic, with Christopher Eccleston and, what's his name, James Bond and Gina McKee. And he read, and he had his youth theatre group with him, and they all had parts in the show. And the audience was full in the back room in this pub. And suddenly, just before we started, there was a kerfuffle and at the door, and all of my teachers from the comp, from Woodham Comp, came in. And so after school, they'd all gone off to have a drink and then come out and see me read this story, which was so touching and so moving. And I got to talk to them all afterwards. John Bleasdale and Lynn Heritage and Miss Robson and others. I forget who else, but there was a gaggle of them who'd come from Woodham Comp that night to Middlesbrough. And I'll never forget that. Not long after that, I read in Newcastle for New Writing North, which was this amazing organisation that helps out writers all over the North. Now the whole of the North, it used to just be the North East, and was very dependable and gave out grants, and I judged prizes for them at one time. They've kind of ignored me in recent years, which is a bit disappointing. I think I've fallen off people's radar, and I don't know why. I've suffered quite a few wilderness years in one way or another. I don't care, though. I don't really care. I just get on with what I do. But they put me on in 97, and it was a nice pub underneath or near Tyne Bridge. That's how I picture it. I can't remember exactly what it was called or where it was. And it was lovely, lovely Bridget O'Connor who organised it, who later became my good pal when she was our writer in residence at UEA several years later. And she died young in 2001. Just terrible. But I knew her for a few years, and the first time I met her was at this reading where she put me on with Anne, her name's gone, the woman who writes Vera. I'm hopeless. Anyway, Anne was very nice, and yeah, that was 97. I think it was round about her first book coming out at that point. It's very odd. All these people like Joanne Harris and Anne, who writes Vera, have become massively successful. I was around when their first books were coming out, because mine were too. It's nice. It's nice having Anne Cleeves, of course. It's nice having these people who've done really well. Kind of thinking I've been there the whole time. Same with students who I taught, or people who came on the course and I worked with on their stuff. And some of them you're really pleased that they've done really well. Others you think, I could give you a list of those I don't approve of. Anyway, lots of other stories about readings and stuff. They're funny do's. I love doing readings. I've always felt very at home standing in front of any kind of audience, even if it is just the blind man and his dog. I once travelled right across the country on Halloween on the train for hours and hours and hours to be in a library to do a reading with Robert Shearman, and he'd come miles and miles and miles as well. And we both got there, and we both said hello to the blind man with the dog and the librarian, and we sat down and talked to each other for an hour and read. And even though there was hardly anybody else there, the dog was very appreciative and the blind man seemed to be. And then we had these long journeys back to our respective homes, and that was Halloween, for whatever year that was. But it was still kind of worth doing. If the company's good, it's worth doing. There are some awful ones. I've been paired with people that I've had to read with who have been unspeakable. There was somebody I read with in Yorkshire once, a fellow Doctor Who author, who just before we went on, in front of this quite large audience, said, "Hey, I've read your first novel." This is in my ear just before we go on. And it was ropey. It was really ropey. Just to kind of, knock me off my stride, which of course it did for about 30 seconds. People will try and sabotage you, and sometimes it's surprising who those people are and why they'll do it. Very odd, because it's weird. You're all on the same side. As Patricia Dunker used to say years ago when she worked at UEA with me, writing isn't a contact sport. It's not a competition. And writers always, always have to support each other and look after each other, because nobody else will look after us. And she was right. Anyway, that's the end of that. I'm going to go. I will talk to you again soon. And yeah, look after yourself and happy reading. Goodbye.